All right, let's get this party started. Everybody who is here, welcome to another Chicago Brewseum virtual happy hour, where we aim to bring you all kinds of topics about beer history and culture, past and present. We are always so thankful for the support of all of you out there who just gather with us in any way, shape, or form that we're allowed to gather. And certainly thankful for this amazing team that makes up the Brewseum, from different people in different industries, for our boards, to the newly launched League of Historians, which I'm very excited. And I'm excited to have Jennifer and Tiah here, who are part of that amazing League of Historians team. I'm also excited for this chat because A, it features women, and that's always exciting to get some different perspectives. And it's also the first time we've actually had a conversation about actually looking into records and archives. And that is sort of the not so glorious thing that happens behind a lot of the magic curtain when you talk about some of these different histories. So I'm excited to hear what you two have to say about just doing a lot of that searching in those books, lots of books, deciphering. There's a lot of sleuthing. I know that happens. And certainly interested in hearing what you've learned in some of your personal journeys, professional journeys. For those of you watching before we get started as well, if you're on Zoom, please use the chat room to share information about what you're drinking, information just about you, ask questions in there. That chat room is your virtual bar, tap room, archives, whatever you choose it to be. Use it as a social space. If you are watching on Facebook Live, hello, welcome. And please ask any questions in the comments, and we'll filter them out and throw them at Tiah and Jennifer later on. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer and Tiah. Thank you both for being here and for doing this for us and for your support and being on our team.
Happy to do it.
I'm going to share my screen.
And I'm going to exit now.
Right.
I find it hard to present because then I find myself, I look at myself. So Jennifer, maybe I'll minimize it and just look at you.
Okay.
Also, I have fancy PowerPoint, and so it will transcribe at the bottom. Yeah. So it's fancy, and I don't even know why it's fancy. So don't be distracted by that. Well, thank you to everyone who's attending live and who will watch this later. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share what I've been working on, and I know there's been cool overlap with Jennifer and I and how our love of census records. I'll just get that out. Like we love census records.
Let's just talk about the census for the next 60 minutes.
We could, and also my glitter pen.
And like only 2 decades of census too, to be clear, like there's very specific census, yes.
Yes, I'm almost done with 1870, not quite, but I'm almost there. So here's us. This is what we do, and where you can find us on Twitter. I put us out of order. Since I'm talking, I'll start. So I run the Oregon Hops and Brewing Archives here in Corvallis, where it is finally sunny, and you will see from my screen it is blaring in my face. For those who are not here, also the warning about my cat may come through, so that will be fun. I started the Oregon Hops and Brewing Archives almost 7 years ago, which is exciting and sort of shocking to me that it's been around for so long, and that 7 years seems like a long time in terms of beer history archiving, but it definitely has changed the way that I think about my own work and the work that I do. But I've also really focused in a lot on recording stories of women, and then my kind of personal obsession with trying to uncover some of the stories and learn more about women in 19th century Oregon. And that's what we'll talk about today.
And I'm, as you can see, Jennifer Jordan. And I'm unfortunately chair of the Department of Sociology. I mean, it's a great honor, but it's a very difficult time to be a first year department chair. So I'm almost done with my first year. And I have been at UWM for 20 years. And as I was sort of thinking about today, I was thinking about how I have a really interesting habit of radically changing my research from one project to the next. And so, 25 years ago, I was working on Berlin and the urban landscape and memory after the fall of the wall. Then I wrote a book about tomatoes and apples. And now I'm writing a book about hops. And it started out to be something much broader, and it has become much narrower. And we could talk kind of more about this, partly because the archival sources turned out to be so rich. I found so much more than I ever thought I would find. And what that has meant is that a project that started out covering 1,000 years and Germany to England to New York to Wisconsin is very possibly going to be focused on one county in Wisconsin. And that is, again, because of the richness of the archival material available. And I'm also clearly a sort of unique kind of sociologist. I'm a historical and qualitative sociologist, and a lot of my work is focused on the 19th century, certainly also 20th century in different things, but even though my topics change dramatically, they've all used very similar methods of doing qualitative analysis of archival sources. So, for starters.
Do people have questions before we start talking about a couple of specific people and then get into talking more about our love of the census? It's the awkward Zoom pause where you have to wait way longer than you do in a class. Okay.
Looks like we might be good.
Okay.
Should I talk a little bit about, never mind, you've got a slide there. So excellent, there she is.
Yeah. Would you like to go first and talk about your lady, or do you want me to go first and talk about my lady?
I can go first, and because I don't have images, we can look at Louisa while I talk about Nate. Oh, well, there we go.
I know. This is a shock. I told you, Jennifer, I love making PowerPoints.
You're amazing. You're amazing. So there are, almost no women farmers in Wisconsin I've looked through the 1850, 1860, and 1870 census, mostly in one county, not all of Wisconsin, but the main hop growing county and then some other counties. And women are almost never listed as farmers. Sometimes they're listed as owning farm. So in the case of Nancy Humphrey, she shows up that way in one of the census records. Let's see, sure enough, there you can see at the very top, Humphrey Nancy, owning farm. And her oldest son, now I can't read it in that.
I think it's 24, superintendent of the farm.
Superintendent of the farm, and then another son is the farm laborer. So this is incredibly rare to see a woman actually listed as owning farm. And the reason I found out about her is because of Google Books, which is also one of the main sources that I use, because so much has been digitized and made searchable. So anytime I want to find out something about something in the 19th century, I do a bunch of Google Book searches just to see if somebody has written about this. And then I also, for example, I would just put hops Wisconsin, into Google Books. And that's how I started to find these old histories of specific counties. And so the only reason I learned about Nancy Humphrey is because somebody wrote a paragraph about her in one of these old histories that are almost exclusively little one paragraph biographies of men. So she's one of the few women to actually be recorded in these kind of pioneer histories, which I will also say are also all white people. even though it is not only white people living in this space, but that's who gets recorded in these kinds of pioneer histories. And so searching for hops, the just keyword hops in this book, led me to this little anecdote about Nancy Humphrey and crediting her with originating the Humphrey seedling and or a hop dealer naming the seedling after her and calling it Humphrey seedling. There's one or two conflicting accounts that locate its origins in New York State, but more accounts, for what that's worth, credit Nancy with creating it. And as you can perhaps tell from the census record, she's a widow. She also once had 7 children. So here there are only 4 listed. I'll say, see, we're already getting started in our census talk. If you look at, this is like the teacher in me, like I want to point at the screen. It's not helpful to you if I'm pointing, but look at the ages of her children who are here, 24, 20, 18, 14. So there's a 4-year gap, a 2-year gap, a 4-year gap. Now that could mean somebody, probably most likely the gaps would be 2 years, right? That's very common in these large families. And so this could be that children have died, which in this case they did. But it could also be that between 2024, it could be a daughter got married, right? And there's this weird way that young women completely disappear from census records, and you don't know if they're dead or if they were married, right? And then they suddenly have a different name. So trying to track these women through the census has a particular challenge. I've been trying to write a piece about her for a while, but one of the links is that she lost her husband and 2 daughters in the space of 2 days to typhoid. And so that, in this current era too, it's a place to think about also, epidemics and pandemics and their link to farming and to beer as well. That kind of the movement of disease across the landscape is also very perceptible in these census records if you kind of know how to look for it. But that can be the start of my intro, and I'll hand off to you, Tiah.
You wanted to say anything about the map?
Oh, since you got it up there, sure. This is another fantastic source. It's one, just like with the census, you have to look at all of them critically, take them all with a grain of salt in terms of spelling, in terms of all kinds of things, in terms of silences and absences, right? There are names, some names here, but they're not everyone's name. This is also a time when Ho-Chunk people are living on this land despite so-called removal. There's plenty of Ho-Chunk presence that's completely invisible in a map like this. All you see is white land ownership, right? Yankee and then European white settler land ownership listed in all these names. So if you see each thing that looks like a name there, that's an owner of a particular plot of land. And there you can see G. Humphrey, and that was Nancy's husband, George Humphrey, listed as the landowner there. And one thing that's helpful is that this spot is, if you look at the same map, one of the major hop dealers is just a few kind of quadrants away. And so all of this sort of confusion about whether her hop was a New York hop or a Wisconsin hop, it's entirely plausible that Humphrey's seedling could have moved from Wisconsin back to New York, because Jesse Coddington, the hop dealer who lived nearby, he lived in New York State for a while. He was from England originally, lived in New York State. He absolutely had connections back. So it's not unusual that there would be a flow of kind of plant material between Wisconsin and New York, and possibly going eastward instead of just westward. And then this map doesn't have too much in terms of, it mentions the iron mine, the lime quarry, the lime kiln. Often other parts of the same map will mention tamarack swamps, which were, the tamarack trees were used as hop poles. So people would go in and deforest the tamarack swamps and sort of harvest hop poles out of them, because they're a nice, narrow, straight tree. But yeah, this is another kind of remnant of Nancy, but hidden by the G, by the name of her husband, even though once he died, she kept running that farm.
What year is this map?
This is 1859.
And then is the census 1870 or 1860?
There's 1860 and 1870. Oh, the one, I think I put up 1860 and 1870. I think 1870 is the one where she's owning the farm. Yeah, because George is still alive in the bottom one. So that's 1860, I believe. And note too, like there, the last name is spelled Humphreys. Up here, I'm not sure if it is or not. And it's sometimes an E, sometimes not. And that's another thing where the census and the maps, you have to be so, I mean, you know, Tiah, but you have to be so diligent about trying different spellings, about cross-referencing the text version in Ancestry.com with the handwriting version of the census too. It really, it takes a lot to sort of zero in on it. And then some things you'll just never really know the answer to. And that's a lot of this stuff is very satisfying, and you can really whole stories kind of emerge out of the archive. And other times you just hit a wall and it's like, well, that's it. There's just no going any farther.
Yeah, I'm going to skip forward a couple. So this is, mine is Louisa. So hold the picture of Louisa in your head. Well, I'll do a little introducing of her, and then I want to skip ahead to a couple of slides to show kind of this diligence that you have to have for finding people. So this is Louisa. I have titled her as a philanthropist. In the census, she is keeping house a lot. She was married to Henry Weinhard, who was a brewer and is arguably, I would claim, probably the most famous brewer in Oregon. He had a really, really, really large facility in Portland, in what's now called the brewery blocks. And actually his facility that he built in the 1860s, parts of it are still there, but it's just down the street from what used to be where Bridgeport Brewery was, where the original Widmer Brothers Brewery was, and where the original Portland brewery was. So there's still lots of breweries around there, but the early foundational craft brewers in Portland and in Oregon as a whole were within throwing distance of Henry Weinhardt's factory because it was zoned for industry, essentially. So Louisa here was born in Germany in 1832. She lost her mother when she was 4. She traveled from Germany to Missouri when she was 15. She came to the Northwest when she was 23 and married Henry when she was 28. She died when she was 85, 1918. I did actually think, like, did she die in the pandemic, the 1918 pandemic? I don't think so. She died of heart failure, and there doesn't seem to be, there's no mention of sickness. I mean, she was 85. And it was 1918, so she certainly had lived a long life. But by the time she died, she buried her husband and 4 of her 5 children. And she lived a really interesting life. And the part of what really drew me to her, so I've been doing research on the wives of brewers. And this woman that I interviewed, Dana Garbs, who is a chemist, a brewing chemist who lives in Eugene, she'd written this post about the first Oregon women brewers, and they were all 19th century women. And I haven't actually been able to confirm that any of these women were brewing. I don't think any of them were. They were married to brewers. These were family businesses, so probably they were doing stuff related to the business. But I think I really wanted to discover that there was this hidden treasure trove of women who were brewing in, all throughout Oregon. In the 1850s, 1860s, Oregon is really developing as a place of white settlers. As Jennifer was saying, the Oregon became a state in 1858. It certainly didn't suddenly get people in 1858. So the process of removal and where people settled often is a record of that settlement and taking over of that land. So there were breweries that would open up in mining towns, in logging towns, in near water. So the Columbia River and the Willamette River basically intersect at Portland. And everything in this kind of coastal range valley, the Willamette Valley, is about an hour from the coast. So we're surrounded by water, and that certainly is reflected in where people settled and breweries opened. So I have done a lot of research about different women related to brewing, and I can certainly say more about that, about Oregon women. But I got really hooked by Louisa, and I hadn't seen this picture. I did this in this really, really large, long article that's currently in the peer review process for the Oregon Historical Quarterly. And initially I wanted to write about 3 women, and I didn't think I'd find that much. But I found this. That's my glitter pen. I'll pause long enough for my glitter pen. So I found this article up here. The Mrs. Weinhard, wife of the millionaire brewer in Portland, was expected to arrive in the city, the Dalles, to attend the golden wedding of her brother, W.G. Wagenblast. And I was like, wait, that's her maiden name. And I think that, again, anyone who's done research on women, you don't get women's first names often, and to get their maiden names is like golden.
Yeah.
This is an incorrect spelling of her maiden name, but this was the kind of corner, the little loose thread that I was able to pull. And I think it ended up that I only wrote about Louisa for this article, and will certainly continue to work on my other ladies, as I call them. But I was able, literally based on this article, this one little mention, I found information about her brother. His name's Gottlieb. He lived in Eastern Oregon for a while. She and her family settled in Missouri. Half of her family settled in Missouri, and then 1 to 3 of her brothers at some point came out here. One of her brothers settled in Sacramento. I think the other went, but Gottlieb was her oldest brother, and he settled maybe in Vancouver first. It's a little bit tough to decide that or figure that out, but he came actually across in 1855 with this guy named Willem Keel, who is the founder of a couple of Christian communal settlements. So those who are familiar with Oregon, he founded the Aurora Colony, which has fabulous antiques now, lovely little city. But he founded the Aurora Colony, and then had also originally founded a colony in Bethel, Missouri. And I got really, really distracted by that, because I thought, oh my gosh, was she like from the Aurora Colony? Like, this is amazing. She wasn't. And I think he came across just because people were coming across, and it was, wagon trains have multiple wagons in them. But she did travel to meet her brother, and she traveled by ship. And this was something that I found really fascinating. Again, those kind of clues that you have to have when you're thinking about wealth and place and privilege. She sailed around. So she and Henry were not married at the time, didn't know each other at the time, but she sailed to Panama, and then across Panama and up to San Francisco or Fort Vancouver. And this was a real marker of wealth. So if you didn't come across by wagon train, by foot, by horse, you could tell something about somebody's wealth and status based on that. I also learned a lot from the census, and the census, of course, as we've said over and over again, is our favorite. One thing that I have gotten really into is thinking about people's neighbors.
Totally, yeah.
Like, who is their neighbor? What are they doing? I mean, I'm like this in my own neighborhood too. So I can be a nosy neighbor in 1870, in 2020. You can learn about the ages of people's children if they had people living with them. So towards the end of her life, she had servants who lived with her. and what were their nationalities, and does that say anything about who, there's a lot that swirls around Germanness and Irishness as it relates to alcohol, and so who was living with them, and can you make any leaps or not make leaps? It's hard because it's a line in a government document. I also was, the other fabulous thing, it's weird to say fabulous, I love obituaries. I will say though that obituaries should be taken with a certain grain of salt because they are being written about people at a time when you want them to sound good. You want to say positive things in somebody's obituary. And also, not everybody is fact checking stuff for obituaries. And so I found that you can get a lot of really interesting, good detail and can find clues about maybe what people valued. Louisa and Henry were really involved in German aid societies and the German Lutheran Church. There's a lot of evidence that the German Lutheran Church kind of shaped her entire social sphere. And so again, it's this picking out of who did she leave money to? You've got a reference to the Weinhard plant entertaining guests for a luncheon. So there was this kind of social aspect. The other thing that's up at the top right is a sales record, a land sales record. And I think as Henry's, he had lots of property. He was really, really wealthy. And throughout the state. And so as his estate was being settled, there was lots of information about where he owned saloons in Astoria, or if he had ice houses in Southern Oregon. So there's these land transfers and estate records are really fascinating too. And I think though what I'm guessing that Jennifer has had the same experience, is that you find these details, and I just wanted to know how she felt. I wanted to know, her husband was accused of owning prostitution brothels because he was a brewer who owned a saloon. And I thought, what was that like? What were her feelings there? I'm curious, did she speak English? Was she in a really small community because the German community was very tight? And so what was her outside involvement like? I don't know. I will say the other thing that I think a lot about, and this sort of great lesson of Louisa Weinhard, is that her husband is still very famous. He died 1904, she died 1918. He's still very famous. And it was nearly impossible to find any records about him. I think there are 3 total photos, paintings of him. He basically looks the same in all of them. But it made me think about this kind of documentation. If we're reading into things like who had their stories in newspapers, who was recorded in the census, who owned land, that's a very, how do we tell the kind of complete story of an area or an industry when government records aren't recording things like women as farmers? I just finished a section for I think it was the Umatilla County, and there was a tribe there. And so the people who were recorded were all of the Indian agents, but nobody who lived there who was actually a tribal member was recorded. And so again, this kind of absence of what people do. I did find this picture. The picture of Louisa is my crowning achievement after I don't know, having my daughter, having a job. But I found this picture. I was desperate to find a picture of Louisa, desperate. And I was Googling, I'm sure people have done this where you're doing the mindless Googling where it's you don't even remember what you were Googling. I literally can't remember how I did this. There was a mention of a portrait of her that was hanging in a Portland Community College building because the building used to be the German old people home, and she had donated the land and money to build this. So there was this painting of her, and I contacted their community relations person, and I said, is this still hanging up? And she said, no, it's not. It's in a closet, but here's a picture of it. And I was like, Louisa's in a closet. So she sent me the picture. I literally have it on my desk.
Oh
like,
my gosh.
Like, and this is my daughter. So she has like, she's next to my daughter. My daughter's now 16. She's probably loves that I'm showing this picture of her. But I found this picture of her, and it was like she became real. It was a very strange sort of feeling to see her as a person. We are going to accession. We are going to get the transfer of this portrait of her. I was supposed to get it like 2 days after we shut down. So that will happen. But I think pictures of people are golden, and it is, again, though I read a lot into her picture too. I'm reading a lot of detail into the expressions on her face. Yeah. I will pause again and check chat for questions before we.
I've been monitoring. It looks good.
Okay.
Looks like there's no gotcha questions in there.
Yeah, now I'm going to go to the glitter pen. Yes, I see that you want the glitter pen. So the glitter pen.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, so these are a couple of quotes that when we were going in order, this was going to be a meaningful transition.
Sorry.
No, I'm the one who went forward to my articles. But this idea of that we exist within the stories that people tell about us, and thinking about where the details of our lives are, and how we leave records as people now in 2020, the records of our lives, and what do the traces and the remnants of what we leave behind. What would that mean for somebody telling us a biography? And if we read a biography of us after we had passed away, would that feel representative of us as individuals? So I think thinking about sources and stories and how we exist and what it means to be reading into these records. And also this idea of hidden history. And I love it because it's such a nice little alliteration. But while there are hidden stories, the details also just weren't recorded. And I think that's really hard for archivists. It's really hard for people doing historical research to know that it just might not be there. Like it may be that it wasn't valued in a way or recorded in a way.
And sometimes archives catch fire, right? So part of, is it saws? There's one of the Czech hops is very hard to get certain kinds of research because the city archive burned at a certain point. And then, am I right that it's the 1880 census that a lot of that is also just no longer? Is it 1890?
Yeah.
I think you're right. Yeah. Where it's like, well, okay, we can't, and we can think that that hiding, the idea of hidden stories, if we turn that into kind of an active verb, right? Like who is hiding things. So sometimes it's very intentional, right? Some people count as citizens or count as people to be recorded in the census. Some people don't. Or it can be, destruction of archival records, which, there have been a few instances just in the last couple of years, right? In Brazil, I think, and then in the Tenement Museum, where lots of things are collected, to keep sort of safe and precious, but if they're not in some way duplicated, a fire or a flood can just destroy it. So that's another form of hiding. And then, like you say, certain elements of our lives that are just no one ever asks a question about, right? I would give anything for, well, not anything, but I would be really interested in a picture of the inside of my refrigerator in my childhood, what was in there in 1977, and it would just be this flashback to childhood. Or what if we could see photographs of the insides of people's refrigerators or medicine cabinets or whatever over the past 100 years. So there is this kind of all kinds of elements of our lives that just completely vanished, even within our own lifetime. What did the grocery store look like when I was a kid versus what it looks like now? That's gone, unless you can do some Google image searches for 1970s supermarkets, but it's not quite the same thing. And there's, at least in Milwaukee, and I think other places too, there's a lot of effort to create like a pandemic archive to sort of mark, what life is like under these conditions, and kind of preserve that for the future. And it's making some people, I have a colleague who's doing this from Milwaukee, but, more conscious of what are the remnants of our lives, pandemic or not, that we kind of leave for future generations. And in the digital world, that has all these other implications, right? There's such a photographic record of so many people's lives, of, selfies or whatever else. When I was doing my dissertation research, I thought about every photograph I took because I knew it was going to cost me 50 cents to develop it at the drugstore in Berlin. And so, there are so few photographs from that research, even though it was really important to my research, but I was so careful because it was so expensive. And now there's just this kind of explosion of images, but who knows, where those images will be 100, like another, the equivalent of your lifetime to Louisa's lifetime, for example. From now,
Yeah.
how will that persevere?
Well, and it seems very, again, the sort of interestingness. There is actually a picture of her I found later I was going to show it, but it's actually propping up my computer right now. I have it on the front of my census notebook. Her riding in a carriage, and somebody wrote a dissertation, wrote a thesis about the Weinhard family and interviewed her great-great-grandchildren. And the great-great-grandson said, "Oh, there's this picture of my grandma and she looks like Queen Victoria." And I was like, "Where's that picture? Oh my God, where's the interview? Like what? Like you can't just say that." And then I found it in the newspaper.
Oh, wow.
Glitter pen time. So I just wanted to show a couple of ways that people are recorded and these considerations that we have about the census. So these are all from the 1870 census. There are prostitutes recorded. Sometimes prostitutes are called prostitutes when they are recorded. That is how they are reporting themselves, or how the census taker is reporting them. So take your pick on that, whether we call one more reliable or less reliable. Down at the bottom left, you'll see saloon keeper, his wife is keeping house. There's a keeping house woman who's the head of house. So you see Mary Delon is 45. She is so she's Indian. She was Native American, born in Washington Territory. So you'll see up at the top, the prostitutes, the C is Chinese, and then I is Indian, so Native people, and then doubtful. This is one that I was coming across. There was a census taker who I think was trying to say somebody was a prostitute. I don't know what doubtful was. The other thing that I found this a few days ago, that there's this farmer, so on the far right up in the top corner. So there's the farmer, and there's a house laborer and a farm laborer, which I thought was pretty interesting. So the woman, Mary, is the house laborer, and her son is working as a farm laborer. And I'd never seen that before. I'd usually just seen keeping house, and sometimes you'll see housekeeping. Housekeeping, I think, means that you get paid for it, and keeping house means you're doing it in your own house. This one, Jennifer, is one that I think I sent to you. It's one of the very few female farmers, people who are actually women who are actually labeled as farmers. As head of household for the most part, even if it's clear that the women must have been running the farm. They owned the farm. They were the head of household. Their kids are working on the farm, but they're still labeled as keeping house. This was where the glitter pen got out of control. So, the glitter pen, that I wanted to point out again, the races being recorded, the places where people are from being recorded. So it's usually country if they are from not from America, and then place Washington Territory. Washington wasn't a state yet, so Washington Territory was recorded. you also, for a time, 1860, I think, and 1870, had this estimation of income, which is super unreliable, unless you have a census taker like this one, who's like 2747. But it's real estate value and then personal wealth values, like savings value, which I think even if it's all lies, even if it's not right, I find it fascinating. I always write it down. I find how people report their income super fascinating. The final thing on the right side is a literacy a literacy check. That's a weird way to put it, but it's whether someone can read and write. And so that's, again, I think this sort of like, was somebody in school, could they read or write? Who's making those? I don't know if it's self-reporting, if it's head of household reporting, but I think that's something that I always pay attention to too, mainly because I just don't know if it'll seem interesting later. But I figure if I'm reading the census, I should record stuff. This is the only female saloon keeper I've found. This is a saloon keeper in Portland. And then on the right side, there are a couple of African-American saloon keepers, and there were very, very few Black people in Oregon. There still are very few. So the fact that, and most of the people who are recorded in the census have jobs like jobber or things related to, like, it's not boot black, what would it be called? There's another, like, shoe shiner. So these that's usually what their occupation is. So I found it pretty fascinating that there were saloon keepers. I have also found that sometimes people are labeled as B for Black when they're from Portugal. So I'm not entirely sure how much is self-reporting, how much is like observational. So yeah, that's these like non-white, non-Irish, non-German saloon keepers are pretty noteworthy. This is my final, this is from just down where down in my family's stomping ground. So my family has been in Oregon since the farthest I can trace back is a woman who arrived in the late 1840s. So I've been here for a long time and down the road, 40 miles. So this is from my neck of the woods. So you see what these people are doing. So old maid, helps her ma, plods about. That is still one of my favorites. Plods about.
Just amazing.
Plods about. There's, yeah, there, yeah. Squatter, which again, I'm like, I don't know what, like, that seems like an odd occupation, but it's what was recorded. Yes, so fun finds in the census. We already looked at this. And now we have time for questions. Do people have questions? Questions in person? Questions.
I can talk about graveyards if people don't have questions.
What do you want to say about graveyards?
So I spend a lot of time in graveyards because the hop farmers are all buried out there. And so to go back to what you were talking about neighbors, so in that map where we saw the Humphreys, just across the way were Nancy's relatives, the Donnellys were sort of kitty corner across the street. And so all these farmers, I use the agricultural census and the population census, which are distinct. And in the ag census, right, somebody's walking from one house to the next. And so there's a flow in the census that corresponds to the map, more or less. They're going in different directions. It's not always easy to find the neighbors, but usually the people near each other in the census also live near each other in physical space and are sometimes related to each other. And they're usually buried together. So it depends on their religion. So sometimes they'll sort of split depending on if they're Lutheran or Episcopalian. And Nancy Humphrey was Anglican, so she was buried in an Anglican Anglican cemetery, fairly distant from where her home was. And I found it last summer. I had gone to visit a farmer who had wild hops growing on her property. And she and I, she remembered a hop plant being on a cherry tree. The cherry tree had fallen down. I wanted to see, like, are there ditch hops here that are maybe descendants of the hops that grew here in the 19th century? So the farmer and I, like, dove into a thicket, searching for the hop plant, found it. And so that was very satisfying. And after that, I got my car to go back to my little cabin, and I saw this tiny sign on the side of the road that said Anglican Cemetery. And I had seen on a map that there was this Anglican cemetery, but I couldn't figure out how to get into it. And it's because you basically had to go into someone's driveway and then sort of go around the side. And this is research where, like, middle-aged white womanhood grants a certain kind of access. I can sort of be in these rural spaces and not really stand out, and drive into someone's driveway and carry on up to the cemetery, and then spend an inordinate amount of time in the cemetery looking for, and I didn't find Nancy, but I found her husband and then her sister and some other people. And that's also, it's not the same as a photograph, but there's something really intense about, being, I also come from a family of people who get cremated. So I have almost no connection to kind of graveyards and all of that. And so it's very strange that these farmers that I write about, who are so long gone, there's this sort of physical remnant of them in these places. And then there's also this kind of irony that, the farmers are long gone, but many of the plants that they planted persist. So that part of Wisconsin, there's all kinds of hops growing on the margins of, agricultural properties. The land uses have not changed that much from that time period. There hasn't been huge suburbanization or urban expansion. There's been a shift to dairying and to corn and soy. And so the hops get pushed out to the edges of the fields. But it's totally possible to drive around, especially like this time of year, and just see hop vines, kind of winding up trees and bushes on the sides of these properties. So the plants really outlive the farmers in some ways. And that's another kind of archive, and it's a way I think you and I both have had to really learn how to read things in ways that aren't immediately obvious. And that's true sitting in a historical society or on my laptop on ancestry.com using the population census. And then it's also true of landscapes, that it's very easy to misread them. And then it's also very easy for the kind of legibility of a landscape to change after learning more. Now I know to scan all that plant life for like telltale hop leaves. And I can connect those hop plants to that 1859 property map and the 1860 census. And there's still this kind of living, there's a deceased remnant in the cemeteries, and then this living remnant in the form of the plants on the edges of the land.
I had this interesting thing happen. I also spent a lot of time on Ancestry. And again, I can't remember how I actually did this. Like, I don't remember what hole I went down. But I found a couple pictures of Louisa Weinhard's granddaughter on Ancestry. And so I saw that there was a person who was linked, who had uploaded those. And it turns out it was Louisa's great-great-great-granddaughter. And I sent her a message and I said, this is really weird. I know this sounds like creepy stalking, but I found this picture, and I have this picture of your grandma, great-great-great-grandma. Do you want it? Like, do you want this picture? And I think that, again, this sort of telling, it's very, very difficult to not tell the story. It's very, very difficult to tell the story of women because the way that names are handed down and the way that things are recorded, it's told through the story of men. And this was something that this woman was feeling, and that it was really, I think, cool to her to have this story of her great 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 grandma and have it be about her and not have it be about Henry Weinhard, which the story is often about him. But it's a weird, the Henry Weinhard's factory was huge, and it's now, I think historically it's a historic building, so they do have some part of it left, but they tore down half of the block and put up this really like huge steel 250 story, no, not 250 story, 250 room apartment complex with Louisa's name on it. And I thought, oh God, that's like that's an odd marker of her. Like yeah.
Lucas,
so these remnants.
Yeah. And Lucas has a question about wondering how much these historic hops might have diverged from today's varieties. And some people have done some genetic analysis of their like ditch hops. So Oshkosh, there's a fellow up there who's also on Twitter, has written about a book about Oshkosh beer, and has also found the hops from one of the original hop farmers up there, and then planted them and then brewed with them. And I think that he's had some genetic analysis done, but I don't know off the top of my head what the results were. The most likely scenario is that these are cluster or something like cluster. What their kind of botanical relationship is to those first hop roots that were planted in, Wisconsin's hop boom was the 1860s. The first hops were planted in 1837. The industry boomed in the 1860s, completely crashed in 1869, and then kind of continued in some places until the end of the 19th century. But it's likely that people stopped cultivating those hops maybe sometime in the 1870s. And so what exactly has been going on with that rhizome, in the meantime, I'm not sure. And I don't know enough about hop botany to know how it would change. My hunch would be that if you brewed with those hops, you would get something that was going to taste something like cluster, since that would have been the dominant hop grown there at the time. But I don't actually know, being a sociologist and not a botanist, I don't know kind of the details of how that might have changed over time too.
Yeah, that's a question that I'm also, full disclosure before I even say anything, I have a library degree and an English degree, so I am not a scientist. But so there's research, OSU is a big deal because the Cascade hop, the Mount Hood hop, the Nugget hop, were all crossed and bred here. So the Cascade, if we think about the variety of hops that we have now to choose from, pre-Cascade, so pre-early 1970s, was just not even a thing. Like the hop family tree is really small. It's bigger now, but it was really small for a long time. So that's a question that I get a lot, is what was growing here. And it was fungal, early cluster, late cluster. Like it just, there wasn't any real variety. Which in a way makes it kind of nice when you think about, well, were they, it makes it for an easy answer to a question.
Mm-hmm.
The harder question, and I'm guessing, Jennifer, that you get this sometimes too, is the questions about were local brewers or were brewers in Wisconsin using local hops during that time?
Yes. However, there are a few things that it took me a while to kind of figure out, but Wisconsin's brewing industry boomed before its hop industry boomed. So you'll see histories of Wisconsin brewing that'll say, because barley and hops grow so well here, that's part of why the brewing industry developed. And I don't think that's true. I think there was a moment where that was the case, but Wisconsin brewers were brewing with hops from New York State. And then to some extent hops from Germany, I think maybe a little England, just depending on the year and how people's harvests were. But the early Wisconsin brewers there weren't enough hops grown in Wisconsin to fill those breweries at all, not even close. And so hops would come over on ships through the Great Lakes, and then later on the railroad once that came about. And the other thing about Wisconsin hops is that I have not found any evidence at all of any German varieties being grown here. So as much as Germans were, you know, so essential to the rise of brewing here and lager brewing in particular, I have yet to find any mention of a German hop being grown here. I've found one mention of a Belgian family bringing hop seeds with them and planting them, and I can't remember which county, but maybe Fond du Lac County, north of here. And other than that, it just really seems like New York cluster, New York cluster, New York cluster. And that, and then on top of that, the majority of the hop farmers were also not German. Later on, you know, there are German hop farmers, but the leading edge is absolutely English, and then with some kind of New York State connection. So that all surprised me. And then again, Wisconsin hops, you know, yes, they're flowing into Milwaukee breweries and other Wisconsin breweries briefly in the 1860s when there's this huge boom, when all of these women are, you know, picking hops in August and September. And then it changes back to New York State, and then absolutely Pacific Northwest becomes totally dominant.
Yeah, that boom, that Wisconsin boom is fascinating. It's like a hiccup. Whenever I talk about hops history, I always say like it's like the check mark, you know, that came from like New England, but then there was this like huge boom.
Yeah. And I've basically taken something that like many people spend like 3 sentences on, you know, or maybe a couple of pages for understandable reasons. Like clearly the Pacific Northwest is more important, but I've taken that little blip and then turned it into, you know, a whole book, partly because of the, as I said earlier, the richness of the archive too. And I see that Lucas is asking where our research is taking us next. What kind of blank check questions do we want to tackle? For me, I need to finish the book I'm writing, and that is, so I have a first draft, I'm revising it, but for me, revising is also about additional research, and so it's a very methodical process, and part of how I know I'm not done is because I add things in, and I'm finding out things that I didn't know at all. And so when I'm still finding big surprises like that, it tells me it's time to or it's not yet time to kind of wrap it up. It's a good time to keep building the research, keep revising the manuscript, and I'll get there. So, you know, I would say the question I'm still trying to answer is, you know, how did hops arrive in Wisconsin? What effect did they have on the ecology and also the cultural landscape, and then how did they just kind of vanish? And so that's a question that has sustained me for a few years, and is going to sustain me for a little longer too. How about you, Tiah?
I desperately want to get back to my the archives, because I have lots of unprocessed collections that have nothing to do with women in brewing. So there is the thing that I need to be doing, the part of my job that makes me a responsible archivist who is gathering collections to provide to researchers. So I think that like I do think about that, which has nothing to do with this, but I do think about that, the boxes of collections that I so desperately want to put in folders. I am going to take some time off this summer and do, I think, more focused research on a couple of different women. It's a little challenging. I need to go places. I need to go for a couple of these women. I think I really need to go back to the county clerk's offices. There's still a lot of digging. I took a research trip a couple of years ago around Oregon and honestly didn't know what I was doing. I've been an archivist for a really long time. And I think an archivist turning into a researcher is really helpful, but also I didn't know what I was doing. I had no idea how people kept records and where those records would be, and also just how hard it would be to quote every person who's ever written about history. I would like to, I'd like to figure out, and this is again the thing I don't actually think I'll ever get the answer to, but I would like to figure out whether women were brewing. Like where would those records be? There are women who took over for their husbands after their husbands died, and they usually kept the business for a couple of years. There's one woman who ended up moving to Walla Walla, I think with her husband. They started a big brewery there, and she ran it for years after he died. So I kind of want to follow the trails of those a little bit more and see whether for some of these larger breweries, Weinhard excluded, the other women that I've looked at have breweries that were teeny breweries. So there's really not much record of those breweries. So I think trying to track down some of those company records, but brewery records in Oregon, there aren't any. Yeah. It's a very, it's shocking. And I think I keep hoping that somebody's going to find some in a closet somewhere. So that's where a lot of newspaper reading. My other goal is to finish the 1870 census. I will probably read the 1880 census. I will not take as many notes as I did.
Yeah. It can take a lot of time.
Yeah, I do appreciate it now. I definitely have uncovered lots of people who identified as brewers who have never been mentioned anywhere. So I could be doing this literally until the end of my life.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's 6:30. I don't know if Liz wants us to, or Lucas.
Yeah.
6:30. What do you mean 6:30?
Oh, sorry.
Time change joke.
I'm so Midwest-centric.
Yeah, every time I talk to you, I feel like you're always in a census.
Yeah. Yeah. True story.
I feel like you have been in the 1870s for a while.
Yeah, I did teach a class winter term, and then this crazy pandemic thing meant that I had to learn how to teach on the internet. So now I'm back in the 1870 census.
Yeah, again, I can't, it's been tough for everyone to sort of shift gears and do this stuff virtually. And you guys, who are teaching classes, and I know, Jennifer, you're now the new department chair, navigating through new procedures and so many unknowns about, the fall semester and all this stuff. So I know you guys have a lot on your plate. And I appreciate you guys being here and chatting about your research and your process. I'm excited for what's to come with more of this stuff, and certainly to read your book, Jennifer, when it's all said and done. But thank you both again for your support of the Museum and for being on our team. Thanks to everyone for joining us today here on Zoom and Facebook Live. Always appreciate your support. Our next chat happens next Tuesday, when another member of our League of Historians, John Harry, is going to be hosting a conversation with Craig Crosby. Craig is the son of Henry Crosby, who's one of the owners of People's Brewing in Oshkosh. We actually talked about Oshkosh, Wisconsin, during the early 1970s, and it was a Black-owned brewery. So we're going to talk about the history and importance of that brewery during the 1970s as we're ramping up for the modern craft beer era.
I'm also on John Harry's committee, so
nice.
His master's committee.
I love it.
So,
small world that we're all in. I know. So again, thank you, Tiah and Jennifer. Much appreciated. Thanks to all of you again, and we will see you next week.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks, Tiah.